Hi, thanks, Phil. So my name's David Lewis. I'm from CNGL, which is a large research centre in Ireland with several universities. I'm from Trinity College Dublin. And we have here a multi-headed presentation, really to give you an update, fairly brief update on what's been going on in some of the consensus building and really standardisation activities that has been working in parallel very closely with the Multilingual Web series of workshops. It's a core aim of why we come together in these meetings is to try and understand both the benefits. I think some fantastic numbers there from Joachim about the success of previous interoperability, also to understand some of the challenges ahead of us, and that's an ongoing process. So what we're going to give you here is just a little bit of an update of some of the activities that have been going on recently. You've heard some of these details before if you've been at previous multilingual events, but we're going to give you a little update and a little bit of a picture of where we're currently going. So we're both going to be hearing from a little bit from myself in a minute, but first from Filip from University of Limerick, and then from Arle Lommel from DFKI. So David, I'll ask you, are you going to talk from there?
You have the other slide before me.
Okay, so this is just giving you an update. So we'll be covering multidimensional quality metrics from DFKI. I'll be talking about ITS, and David will be talking specifically about XLIFF. And then we'll wrap up with a little bit of a pointer about how this might fit into RDF. David.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. So I'm happy to be part of this panel. Like, we heard some great things about XLIFF from Jan and Joachim, and it's true. Like 1.2 is not a bad standard after all. It's not plug and play, but it's more than promise, I would say. The Lionbridge is not the only people who reaped enormous benefit from 1.2. Like Oracle have made a tremendous translation factory that drives, you see, their WPTG localization of their products like worldwide. You see, Microsoft with Windows content localization is a huge success study for 1.2. But as Joachim said, 1.2, well, it was conceived 2001. Can you believe it? And well, the 1.2 version, well, 2001 was kind of 1.0. There are 3 editions of the 1.x, and so 1.2 is the current OASIS standard, and it's kind of old. It became OASIS standard in February 2008. So time is ripe for 2.0. And as Joachim said, you see, the standard is not plug and play, and it's not tight enough. You see, but 2.0 has, like, the TC has performed research of what was wrong with 1.2, and there was a lot of talking with the wider community, and we believe 2.0 is the right design. And it was announced just yesterday by OASIS administration. 2.0 is now candidate OASIS standard. That basically means we are now waiting for 60 days. If people see there's something terribly wrong with that, then we need to throw it away into a bin. But if this does not happen, then basically in about 70 days we should have the new OASIS standard 2.0. So these links are there not to read, but you see, so that you can click them later on when these slides are made available. We have a test suite which has hundreds of files for validation. How do I send it? Okay, and we are having a 5th XLIFF symposium next month in Dublin. It's part of FESH Guild pre-conference of localization world in Dublin, June 3 to 4. So come there, discuss it. You see, be part of the community to discuss the upcoming standard. You can look up the accepted speakers there, keynote by Chase Tingley. Other, you see, XLIFF heavy hitters will be talking, like Yves Savorel, Brian Schnabel. They will tell you all about it. And more importantly, there will be info sessions on the further steps on 2.1, 2.x, because 2.0, you see, the main reason for 2.0 is to make the standard nimble, to allow quick releases. Part of the Fesh Guild event is also the content analytics meets localization. It will be kind of nicely mixed together. We found that these things work well together. We've been working great together with the ITS group in W3C. So, as I said, 2.0 is redesign. It's not backwards compatible with 1.2. One of the main goals of the redesign is to make it lightweight, to make the core small. You see, the core is now about 20% of the 1.2. One of the problems with 1.2 was it was too big. Everything was core. So how do I choose my bit? So now, you see, we've consulted the community. We have the 20% that are non-negotiable. And all the advanced functionality is available through modules. 8 modules have made it to 2.0, but we want now to do every year a 2.x release with new modules. So come and tell us what are your features, what you need for your localization process. And they will make it in one of the, you see, if you are committed, if it's well designed, if there is, you see, they can make it into further releases. 2.1 is fairly specific by now. It's clear that I mentioned before that there was collaboration between ITS 2.0 development and XLIFF 2.0 development. So even now, ITS 2.0 works in XLIFF 2.0 as an extension. But the plan is to make it official module, protected module within the XLIFF, to exchange all these great 20+ data categories that ITS provides. Another plan for 2.0 is advanced validation support. Well, Felix Sasaki is going to report on it in June on the XLIFF symposium in Dublin. Yves Savorel is going to report on the ITS mapping. And most importantly, we will discuss XLIFF 2.x roadmap. There will be an open requirements gathering session chaired by Brian Schnabel. We will collect, you see, from the wider community requests for features for future releases. And Kevin O'Donnell from Microsoft will introduce the plan for the yearly development schedule for 2.x releases. How am I doing with time?
Where's the clock?
Sorry? Yeah, so
we're about 8 minutes in.
Am I?
About 8 minutes into it, so about right.
Okay, so I'll mention just fun thing. Well, Jan has shown some nice things with XLIFF, and I want to say something about Microsoft being on the XLIFF DC. I think it's a great case study of an organization committed to a standard. You see, they have 3 people on the TC. The executive sponsor, the project manager, and the person, you see, the engineer. And that's just great. You see, Ryan King, he is the author of the 1.2 model that Jan is using now. And Ryan King is on the TC, on the 2.0 TC. And he makes sure that no critical features for Microsoft get lost in the development. And well, he is the owner of the upcoming multi-language model. Okay, so thanks for your attention. And it's for Arle.
Okay. So thank you, David. I'm going to be talking about something that at first glance doesn't seem to have a lot of relation to XLIFF, and yet it does in ways that I hope we can make clear. What I'll be addressing right now is the result of a project called QTLauchpad. It was an EU-funded project that was addressing the barriers to high-quality translation. And critical in that is the notion of high quality. One of the problems that we face when we talk about translation quality or quality of content in general is that we don't have an agreement about what we mean, and in fact there are many ways of addressing it. We've heard, for instance, Fernando mentioned blue scores, which are widely used for assessing machine translation. And yet if you look at human translation, nobody uses them because the methods are completely different. In fact, just a very brief slide here that talks about some of the problems with using something like blue when you start assessing human translation is that you can have something like this where it's divided into quality bands, very good sentences to very bad sentences. And somebody can make a change that improves the bad end by getting rid of the really, really bad end a little bit. And you get a score improvement. And this kind of score improvement you would get from this is something that somebody would go write a paper at an MT conference and go home and say, yeah, we've made a tremendous stride in MT. And yet, from the perspective of the consumer of content, it's absolutely meaningless because it's improvement and stuff you're going to throw out and retranslate anyway. To put it one way, you've taken garbage and you've made it slightly less stinky. But it shows up as an improvement. Now, by contrast, if we take a method, something like this that eliminates something in the middle and makes the really bad actually a little bit worse, and the almost as bad a little bit, makes that a little bit worse, but then makes the high end get a little bit bigger, you don't see a score increase, but it's actually a huge improvement from a human perspective because the stuff you can use, there's more of it, and it's easier to tell the difference between the good stuff and the bad stuff. So that's why one of the reasons why these methods that everybody says we're going to use to assess MT are problematic. The other problem is if you're trying to assess something that you've never translated before, and you want to know, is this good enough or not, you can't use methods that require reference translations like BLUE or Meteor, because then you have to have a human translate it anyway, in which case, why are you bothering to MT it? So these methods are very good for research and development where you want to say, how does tweaking this system make a difference in a hurry, and you don't want to have a human assess it. So they have their purpose, but it isn't a purpose for assessing content that's going to go out on the multilingual web. It's a purpose for assessing systems and trying to find the best systems. On the other hand, if we want to say we're going to have humans look at translated content, the real problem is that it takes too much time. You can't have humans reviewing 1 million words of something that has to be published today. It's physically impossible. The other problem is that it's often not principled. Anybody who's worked with multilingual content has run into a situation where they've sent something out for review, and one reviewer comes back and says, this is the best translation I've ever seen, and the other reviewer comes back and says, this is so bad it has to be thrown out and retranslated. If you've not dealt with it, that sounds like an exaggeration, but it isn't. These situations occur. But to add on to that, we run into the problem that when we're talking about quality, we don't even know what we mean. We say, I want a high-quality translation. Great. What is that? So, as part of our project, we developed what we call a functionalist definition of quality. And for somebody who says, well, how do I recognize quality? It doesn't really help directly, but it does in the long run. It says a quality translation demonstrates required accuracy and fluency for the audience and purpose and complies with all other negotiated specifications, taking into account end user needs. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it says, does the translation do what it needs to? And have you fulfilled the requirements set before you translate it? If the client says, I want it to use X terminology and I want it to have a reading level of such and such a thing, does it actually meet those requirements? If yes, then it's deemed to be quality, even if somebody else might say, oh, it's not the perfect literary language. On the other hand, if somebody says, well, it must be, it's for my annual report, it must be perfect literary language, then you can say, yes, you have to meet those requirements. Well, and that explains really why we can't use a single shared metric, no matter what it is, to determine quality translation for everything. And even if we could, we have to ask which one. And this is a partial list of some of the things we evaluated in our project. Things like the LISA QA model or SAE J2450, many of which have been developed and put forward as general translation quality models. Some of them are also other tools and so forth. But what's interesting when we started looking at them is they don't agree what constitutes quality. there was only one single item that occurred in every single metric. Other than that, there was no agreement. Some of them might share a few, but not all. And the one that they agreed on was, is the terminology right? There were some that didn't even ask, is it translated correctly? Because some translation quality metrics don't have you look at the source, so you have no way of knowing if it's translated correctly. You have to evaluate the text on its own. So this is the solution we came up with. And you all should be looking at me like I'm absolutely insane at the moment if you look at this huge bowl of spaghetti. There's around 100 different categories. This represents the union of what different people are checking when they assess translation quality. And no one can apply this. You'd have to be absolutely obsessive compulsive to try and do it, and then you'd drive yourself into an early grave. So, no, I'm not kidding when I show that, though. So what we have with this is MQM, which I'm presenting, Multidimensional Quality Metrics, defines a shared vocabulary of terms that can be used to describe the specific issues you check. Also, to simplify things, we have what we call the core, which is a much smaller set of issues. This would probably account for 90% of what people check when they assess quality. Even then, we wouldn't say use all 21 categories here. We'd say just take the ones that actually matter to you. But what's important is that you're using and defining your metrics in terms of a shared descriptive framework so that somebody else can say, you know, my quality, I use these other things. So here's how these compare. Here's how they're similar or different. And you know what the quality assessment means because it isn't just I like it or I don't, or I've examined everything whether or not it's relevant. Beyond that, we have to have a way of selecting what we want to assess. And our approach is to say, well, don't assume, you use specifications. Now, this starts tying into broader research and translation, which says define upfront what your expectations are. There's a set of what are called parameters. They're in an ISO standard, TS 11669. There's a link to at the bottom where you can see more information about some of these. And these are a number of things that are defined. Now, some of them aren't relevant for what we're talking about, like, you know, what are your pay rates? But other things are, what is the expected language? What is the kind of text you're translating? What is the audience? What is the file format? These things seem obvious, but often people requesting translations don't make them explicit, and then problems arise as a result, and they say, oh, I got terrible quality. An example would be you send out a video that was for YouTube, and this came from We Localize in a public discussion once. They said they had a client who gave them a video, and they sent it out to their top-of-the-line YouTube translators and gave it back to the client, and the client said, this is garbage, we can't use it. Well, they started looking at it, and the problem was it was very specialized in biomedical domain. And the general YouTube translators, who were great for general media, didn't know what they were talking about. But it hadn't been specified up front. So the idea here is you specify things up front, and then you use those to select pieces from that core or even that big, huge tree I showed that actually allow you to assess whether it meets those particular requirements. So for example, you might be doing an automotive service manual, and one of those parameters was style, and you say, don't care about style. The only people who are going to read this are my shop mechanics. They don't care if it reads great or not, so we aren't going to check style. But then another person might say, hey, now this is my annual report going out to potential investors. Style is vital, so we're going to check that. So by defining up front how you're defining quality, it allows you to select these things and declare in this shared vocabulary what you're going to check. Here's a couple of examples of things that we've actually done. This one was one we developed for assessing machine translation quality in a research setting. We wouldn't recommend anybody use this for production. It's so specific to what we're doing, and yet it uses this structure. Here's another example. This is how you would visualize SAE J2450 from the automotive industry in this. And you map the existing categories to the names we use, and then it's clear what you're using and assessing. And so here you can see the top is the here's the MQM names, and then there's the J2450 names. And so you can represent almost any metric this way and see how it's similar or different. To make this easier to use, we've provided some online open source tools. One of them you can go to translate5.net. That's an open source translation editor that was originally developed for some German LSPs. Anybody can use it and try it out. Right now it just has the full set of MQM, which is horribly complex. But if anybody wants to try it with a custom set, you can certainly contact me and I'll be happy to set up a project for you with your own data. We also have a simple scorecard thing, which is where you just count data, and there's a URL there. That was developed in the US by our partners at Brigham Young University that have been working on this. And so we're trying to make this accessible to people. Now, here's where we finally hit back with XLIFF and then what Dave will talk about with ITS. It's not immediately obvious from this, but we're looking already at ways at how we would integrate this with XLIFF, because often you need to represent quality data in XLIFF. And one of the ways is that what I've shown you is actually based very closely on some of what Dave will be talking about in ITS. And the ways we represent it share a lot in common with ITS. And so as ITS and XLIFF become more integrated, you could start using this within an XLIFF workflow to represent quality analysis. One of the other things, which I should have mentioned earlier too, by the way, is that many of the issues that can be checked are automatable, so you could have fully automatic quality assessment. They might get some false positives, but it gives you an idea of where to check so that you aren't simply checking everything or doing random sampling. Some of the work we're doing on right now is better defining an MQM namespace, which will facilitate integration. And we already have a mapping between MQM and the ITS 2.0 localization quality issue category that Dave will talk about. You lose some detail when you go from ITS into MQM because MQM just has more, going the other way, MQM into ITS just because there's more in MQM. But by using them in tandem, you could send something out and somebody who implements ITS could use MQM. We're planning further development in proposed projects called QT21 and Cracker, which we've proposed for funding in a new EU funding round. We don't know yet if they're accepted, but assuming they are, there will be further development of tools and so forth. Then very quickly, we're looking for feedback, so we put up a specification, qt21.eu/mqm-definition. If anybody goes there and has comments, suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. We're also working with a number of translation tool vendors right now to get this implemented. The one I can publicly mention right now is XTM International has agreed to implement this, and they're working on their implementation now, but there's some others that have expressed interest. And, well, questions come later, but there's the URL to learn more. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Dave.
Thanks, Arle. So, okay, thanks. So just to wrap up, I'm just going to talk a little bit about ITS 2.0. So that's something a lot of people actually in this room were actively contributing to. You can tell by the sort of tired, aged expressions on their faces. It was a very sort of long and, well, it wasn't that long a task, but it was a very intensive task. ITS 2.0, it is a set of metadata tags, and it's designed to annotate text in documents, specifically HTML and XML documents. And it's, again, specifically to inform processes related to internationalization and localization. So it's quite focused in that sense. It's much more focused than what we heard earlier about schema.org, which is, really trying to help more with search engine optimization. Here we're really targeting the needs of the internationalization and localization domain. So you want to say things that are important in those processes, like whether to translate a particular sequence of words or not. And we want to be able to do that in a way that's very easy for developers of tools to apply. So we want to be able to say specifically which text we want to, for example, be translated or not to be translated. So we want to be either able to annotate individual portions of text, or we want to define rules that we can apply over a whole corpora of documents as well. So we can apply rules that operate over a DOM tree, for example, that say what parts should or should not, in this example, be translated. And ultimately, what we want to be able to do is do that in a standard way. We want to have specifications both for processing metadata, for parsing the rules that can be exchanged clearly between, so that metadata can be exchanged clearly between different tools. So we put a lot of focus on getting the interoperability right, testing it, driving the specification of interoperability through implementations, which is very much the W3C way of approaching this. So what the specification consists of is we finished, it became a formal W3C recommendation at the end of October last year. It consists of 19 different data categories. They're independent of each other, so you can be conformant to ITS just by implementing one of these and running it through a conformance test. So a bit like MQM, it's a menu from which you select things that you want to use. Very difficult to imagine anybody using all of them, but they all address a specific use case. I categorized them in this slide. This isn't formally how we structure it in the specification, just to give you a bit of a feel of the broad range. We backward compatible in nearly everything. I wouldn't say exactly all the data categories with the previous version of ITS 1.0, which was very much focused on how you annotate contents to feed into the translation process, so the internationalization aspect of it, and also a little bit to do with the publication of it. And we extended that in ITS 2.0. There was actually a whole list of things that didn't get done in ITS 1.0 that we addressed, things to do with allowed characters, looking at how much space we had to deal with, pointing to external resources, very sort of mechanical things, but as Jochen was talking about with XLIFF, if you can nail down exactly how to interpret that metadata between one tool and the next, you could really bring down your overheads in parsing content that needs to be translated through a chain. But also the remit we had in ITS was to smooth the way a bit more for integrating language technologies into the localization process. So specifically machine translation, but also forms of text analytics, things like named entity recognition. So we've introduced some metadata there, and again, really having to take into account the fact we're dealing with, in those cases, statistical technology. So we have to worry about metadata such as confidence scores of both of translations or of metadata that we might apply. And then finally, we also extended somewhat the scope of ITS from 1.0 to 2.0 by looking a bit further down the localization workflow, so tracking details such as localization quality issues, which maps onto, as Arle mentioned, some of the issues that they looked at in MQM, looking at the provenance of translation, so who or what translated a piece of text, and I think that could address some of the issues that we heard about this morning dealing with the translation of MediaWiki. So I'm not going to go through all of those individually, but I'm going to throw up a few examples just to give you an idea of what this looks like. So here's one of our data categories, MT confidence score. So we've got a sentence that's been translated into English. Who does that? But anyway, it's been done, and we can express a confidence score about that particular translation, something that would be generated by a machine translation engine. And also there we have to be able to identify which engine produced that confidence score, because they're not necessarily scores that can be compared between engines. So we need to put a bit of context in there. And you can see it's something that we can just, it's a standardized piece of metadata that we just slot into, in this example, a HTML document. Another example is text analysis. This is a piece of text that perhaps has gone through a text analysis program, named entity recognition program, and what that's able to do is identify that a particular word has a certain meaning according to some external reference. So in this case, it's pointing to DBpedia, and it's both got a particular instance reference in DBpedia, but it also references another ontology that identifies that this is also a class of information. It's talking about a place, the place being Dublin, and again, it puts a confidence score in there because we're using a statistical technique, so it's not guaranteed to be 100%. So again, what we do there is we have some standardized metadata that provides a concrete link between content processing and actually, in this case, like the whole world of linked data, and we've been building a relationship between this XML-based and HTML-based content processing workflows and this rich world of linguistic linked data, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. And then final example, this is a little example of how we might mark up a quality issue. So this is, there's a misspelt word there, and it again gives us a number of attributes where we can encode different aspects of that problem. So somebody who is a quality engineer, or in fact some of these categories can be sort of detected automatically. It can be encoded in the document that's being translated and passed on down the value chain, so somebody else can decide, well, do we have to act on it? Do we need to retranslate? Do we need to correct, etc.? Obviously, you can see there's a lot of metadata there. It wouldn't be the intention that that would persist all the way to the publication of this document, but it's going between one portion of the process and another. And typically, it's where you're passing QA tasks from one localization provider to another one. So just a quick summary of what happened in ITS 2.0. We have a number of numbers. I won't go through all of those. We did it in 16 months, which I think, we're fairly proud of. It was pretty impressive even by W3C standards. So it shows that with a bit of concerted action, great coordination, especially by Filip Sasaki, who kept us on the straight and narrow and really showed a lot of us who were very new to W3C how to get something through. It was a very intensive working process, but it worked very well. We had some core funding from the EU, which helped, but we had a lot of input from a lot of other organisations. So we ended up with, during the process, 15 different organisations performing implementations, over 1,000 successful conformance specifications. So we really overshot the minimum that we needed to prove that the standard was working. And I think that was a real pointer to the success a lot of these organisations, or the potential people see in this specification. So just to finish up and sort of tie some of what we've been talking about together, we can see there's been harmonization already between ITS and MQM, ITS and XLIFF, and in fact, XLIFF MNQM, and that's been the result of very good collaboration because we've had people working across the different groups, and that's absolutely vital, and it's been really great, especially Arle and David have been working very hard, both in ITS and in those respective other organizations. I've also touched on the fact that we've been opening the door a bit to moving beyond just XML-based content processing to looking at the benefits of linked data, and that appears in a few places. So we have a mapping from ITS to an ITS ontology, and we use the NLP to RDF specification NIF that comes from the University of Leipzig, and they were involved in the process. We've also had partners, so Phil from Vistatech did an implementation of a quality tool that actually outputted RDF and overcame some of the problems that they had with different quality assessments being in different formats and using RDF to overcome some of those problems. And I've been working both at CNGL and a new project called Falcon, which actually also involves XTM, who Arle mentioned, where we're looking at tracking the provenance of localization processes, both to be able to manage that a little bit better, to capture the really detailed metadata that goes on as you go from step to step to step, and also to be able to search that very freely to gather the very rich training data that you get out of that. So there's been a little bit of work going on in this area, and I just want to point people to the work now going on in the LEADER project. So there's going to be a workshop starting tomorrow afternoon and going on into Thursday, where we're really looking to both extend these use cases, but find other use cases beyond the localization and internationalization areas, and to try and lay out a roadmap and some best practice guidelines for how we start integrating this new world of linked data and RDF with the traditional, if you like, if you want to call it that, XML or DOM, if you like, based translation processes. We have this workshop coming up this next day. We're also going to be having a session at FISGILT. It'll be on the 4th of, so second day of FISGILT, which will be the 4th of June in Dublin, which is co-located with LocWorld. And there's a W3C community group called Linked Data for Language Technology, and we very much invite everybody to try and engage with those processes and come along with your use cases and help sort of guide what might be the next phase of interoperability standardization for the multilingual web. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks to all of our speakers in this block. We have some time for questions. Do we have a mic somewhere?
Yes. XLIFF is wonderful, but it's bilingual. And I noticed a lot of the stuff here is lingual. Shouldn't we use something that is lingual? Because if one takes, Jan, your example, it means that there is like one file for every pair of languages. So this is one. The second item is XML is wonderful also. On the other hand, it's not the most appropriate format for tabular data. It's excellent for publication, but not for tabular data.
Who would like to say that one? Maybe Fahim,
Well,
if you'd like
I
to say
wanted
that.
to address the bilingual thing. Like XLIFF is interchange format, and what you say, it's a service aspect of the industry. Like a translation is by definition from one language into another. So XLIFF has to be bilingual. And well, there is some support for. Well, I made a notes like what people required this morning. Like they required, for instance, changing order of sentences in a paragraph. This is supported in 2.0, and they require, like Charles said, like would I be able to use more source languages? You wouldn't be able to use more source languages in XLIFF, but you would be able to use a reference language. Like you could have translation matches coming from more than one language. You see, for instance, if your target language is under-resourced, say you are translating into Luxembourgish, that there are not many resources into Luxembourgish. So the translator would greatly benefit from having German matches as coming up as a reference language.
In the European Commission, it's quite common to receive one language and it's translated into 23. So this point that is translated from one to another language is not the case. It's translated from 1 to 23 languages.
Well,
first.
of course.
And second is sometimes there is what might call peeping Tom, is I am translated into Spanish. I know my Portuguese colleague already translated chapter 1, and I can go and have a look to the Portuguese because it might suggest certain things. This is the reality.
Sure,
Okay.
you can do it through the reference language.
It's not a reference language. It's
I just want to confirm again what David has been saying. So I'm a member of the XLIFF TC as well. So I think it was an anonymous, whatever, conclusion when we discussed it, that we do not want to have XLIFF being multilingual, but only bilingual. And the reason is really, otherwise you have a bag full of fleas or cats or whatever your culture prefers. You can't handle it from a service aspect. So you don't know when you get returned all languages which you had requested for the original XLIFF file, because they are all translated by different translators. I understand your problem, and I think this is exactly the point which I fear not really was able to bring into the audience. So I think XLIFF is also a old paradigm format. It is a document-centric format. That's its purpose and nature. And what you want and need is actually a dynamic, online, on-demand access to data which is produced right now. And we need, obviously, solutions for this.
totally agree.
Yeah. But XLIFF 2.0 is great anyway, because document formats will not go away, and obviously you can create documents as large as one sentence as well. So just to be said.
I'd like to also comment on it that I understand what you're saying, and I agree that what we're talking about here about having a bilingual format works really well for where we are today. What we demonstrated briefly as a concept of having a service inside the environment and being able to call from any to any, which was the intent, solves a whole lot of things that we can't do with an XML schema. So there are different purposes, there are different reasons for using them. What I've enjoyed seeing evolve out of the XLIFF 2.0 and the ITS 2.0 conversations are how we're structuring our talks about standardization and multilingual issues, and then the types of service APIs that we can develop because we know each other really well and we understand those requirements, I think we've got a rich opportunity that's presented there as well. So I see it as a stepping stone.
Pedro?
About the same thing, I totally agree with you, but the service results are
the service reasons are the weighty ones, because you cannot control, as you said, when you receive all the language, you cannot report automatically for the follow-up with the client. Something similar happened when when in the CMS, if the client decides to send you, even if it's very short, one content per file, even if it's very small, so you get thousands of files, or just one file with a lot of content. The second thing looks better, but afterwards it's much more difficult to handle, to trace it, and to play with it. So sometimes things that appear simple for the daily life and the service and the control of the process, not for the translation itself, is much more difficult.
Felix, I think.
So in this session there was a lot of conversation about translation workflows, translation quality, automatic manual translation. Dave already mentioned that there is now a project leader which works on resources, multilingual resources, which could be used to improve all of this story. So my question is, and I'm not sure who to ask, I'd like to ask everybody, what is the hindrance of using these resources? Both technically, and we're talking about standardization gaps here also. There might be hindrances like resources are in format XYZ, but translation workflows are using XML or other formats. But there might also be other resources, organizationals or licensing resource issues for these resources. So, I mean, I'm giving answers myself, but also trying to give food for your thoughts. So just to hear what needs to happen that such resources can be used to improve translation.
How's that for an open question?
I can say something. I think actually you addressed slightly the previous question as well. I think that shift to treating multilingual information as an asset, as a resource to be managed, is where we have to start worrying about treating it multilingually beyond just passing it bilingually down a workflow. I think the real issues are, in my mind, quality is really important, because that's typically why you want to manage a resource. You want to assess its quality. So, for example, you have a multilingual translation memory that you may want to use for training machine translation. How assured are you that translations of particular terms are to the same quality in all of those languages? How variable is the quality of all of those different machine translation and different language pairs that you're going to get out of there? And I think behind quality there's a whole bunch of issues. Provenance is an issue, like where did the translations that you're using came from? That's not just the translations of segments, it's translations of terms. Perhaps also other metadata, the definition of terms. How accurate are those? Are they? Who do they come from? What viewpoint do they represent? And we saw some talks about different views, how they shift over time. So even definitions aren't a done deal. Perhaps within a particular company, within a particular era, they might be true, but more broadly they're not. And I think then that also, as soon as you start talking about sharing these resources, the licensing and the ownership of resources becomes really important as well. And how do we go about addressing those becomes, I think it's still something that's probably a little bit foggy in the translation industry. Sometimes a lot of people keep copies of those translation memories and don't always tell everybody. So, that's something, if we're deliberately managing these things as assets, we really need to tie that down.
Jan, are you poised to, no? Okay. Arle?
I'd just add that I think one of the issues we face is lack of experience with these. And so from the commercial side, you look at many of these resources are academic in nature, and assessing their relevance to your business need and figuring out how to use them, even if you determine they're relevant, there's an education process and some experience that isn't widely held yet. And I think with time, we'll see business models, people figure out how to use these and assess them and handle that. And I think that's where Leader can do some of the education.
And I think there's also the issue that traditionally, I mean, business side of our industry and technical side of our industry are quite separate. So if we talk about integration, tighter integration into CMS systems, for example, how to achieve the data exchange, which format, which standard, whatever, we immediately need to talk about the business or the commercial side as well, because this is orders, these are quotes. But in my company, that's not us technical people, yeah, who deal with that, yeah. And similarly, the thought model which evolves around resources and how to reuse them, resources, let's say, more clearly in this case, TM segments, sentences, or whatever, data stored in a silo in a CMS, which could be reused maybe by some other company. You could make a commercial model out of this. Yeah, I mean, you could figure out how to make a commercial model out of this. You only need to create something like a micropayment agreement for segments which you query from some other place. I proposed this since many years, and I think on our technical level, many people understand this immediately. However, on the sales level and on the business model level, I think the idea to seal all content and not open it for reuse is still widespread, and I don't know what needs to happen to change this attitude. I think others need to answer this than technologists.
From a developer perspective, I think that this is a step, and it's only a step forward toward changing how we create software. So in the world of apps, if you think about small development shops or a developer, or not enterprise class, although enterprises deal with apps today in a very profound way. Developers, when they look at adding a language, are looking at, if we'll say ResX, for example, I was playing with ResX today, would be adding a second one and calling it French, and adding a third one and calling it German, and then having to manage the resource shifts and changes as I was iterating on this app. It's what I'm used to, okay? And so by taking a step and saying, well, we're going to represent that in XLF, and we're going to take control of all that workflow for you, so you don't have to think about that anymore. You just think about your single ResX file and in the language that you're writing in, whether your coding is in French or Spanish or German, I don't really care. From any to any is what I care about, and that you don't have to think about that. Once, as technologists, we have control of that conversation, and we can provide quality assurance and business models for those app developers, then how we deliver it into that IDE is the challenge and the opportunity for us. So moving from a set of files to a set of services, I think, is where the sweet spot is. Looking what those business models are to provide quality assurance, rather than thinking about pennies per word or the old school kinds of things. I think that there's a different thing going on here from the apps side of life, and so my challenge here would be to take a look at the current culture of a developer and the developer mindset, and how we're taking some fairly small steps to start to act on that.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thanks to our speakers.